They were the couple everyone believed in. The country music prodigy whose guitar strings carried both ache and hope, and the Hollywood queen whose eyes spoke a language all their own. Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman weren't just a love story, they were a legend being written in real time. Together they were melody and muse, fire and calm, the proof that love could conquer anything. But even the most beautiful songs have silent pauses, and behind their radiant smiles, something delicate was beginning to unravel. The tabloids painted them as flawless. Red carpets became stages for their affection. Photographs framed their laughter. But in private, Keith's songs grew quieter, sadder. Nicole's once bright gaze began to dim, shifting from sunrise to twilight. There were nights when Keith sat alone with his guitar, staring into the dark, wondering whether fame had stolen something love could never give back. And there were moments when Nicole stood beneath flashing cameras, adored by millions, but feeling invisible to the one person she had trusted with her soul. At 57, Keith Urban finally opened the door to a past he had long guarded. Not to defend, not to dramatize, but to tell the truth. It was never about who stopped loving first. It was about who stopped being themselves. His confession wasn't made for headlines. It was spoken for healing. Behind the glitter of Grammys and Oscars lived a wound that had never fully closed, a love that had burned too brightly to last. Before the fame, before the headlines, there was just a barefoot boy in Whangarei, New Zealand, quiet, curious, and captivated by sound. Born on October 26, 1967, Keith Lionel Urban grew up in a humble home with his parents Mary Ann and Robert. His father sold signs and trinkets from the back of a van. His mother worked at local shops to keep the family afloat. Their house creaked in the rain and chilled in the night. But there was one thing that always brought warmth: music. His father adored country legends like Hank Williams, Glenn Campbell, and Johnny Cash. On a battered record player, those voices filled their modest rooms. For little Keith, it wasn't just music. It was magic. He sat cross-legged on the floor, listening not just to lyrics but to the ache hidden between them. That ache felt familiar. When the family moved to Australia, Keith found himself in a world that felt both wider and lonelier. His hair was too long, his voice too soft, his dreams too wild. School wasn't his stage. Kids mocked the boy with the guitar instead of a football. But when night fell and silence wrapped around the house, Keith would sneak into the living room, lift his father's old guitar, and play until his fingers ached. No teachers, no applause, just a boy trying to speak through strings because words couldn't hold what was inside him. His parents saw that spark. Even when bills piled up, they scraped together money for lessons. By his early teens, Keith was performing at local clubs, his voice trembling but sincere. Audiences saw something real in him. His father, proud yet strict, pushed him relentlessly. He wanted Keith to be great, not just good. That pressure forged discipline, but it also carved loneliness. While other boys dreamed of cars and sports, Keith dreamed of Nashville. He taped posters of Dolly Parton and Merle Haggard to his wall, vowing that one day he'd stand where they once stood. Music wasn't just his passion. It was his escape. In the chaos of family struggles, he found refuge in melodies. In those dusty rooms, a musician was born, not from privilege, but from pain. He would later say, "Music wasn't just something I loved. It was how I survived." By 17, Keith was playing with older musicians, his talent undeniable. But even as applause began to replace silence, he carried the ghost of that lonely child inside him. The boy who believed love, like music, needed constant tuning to stay in harmony. When he turned 18, he left for Nashville with a guitar, a suitcase, and an unshakable dream. Nashville was brutal, a battlefield of broken hearts and hungry souls. He played in smoky bars for pocket change, slept on friends' couches, sometimes in his car. Frost gathered on the windshield as his guitar lay beside him like a promise. He reminded himself every morning, "You're closer than yesterday." Record labels didn't know what to do with him. Too American for Australia, too Australian for America. But he didn't quit. He formed bands, collaborated, faced rejection after rejection. Every no became a verse in his story. Then, in 1999, everything changed. His debut American album hit the charts, and But for the Grace of God reached #1, a prayer disguised as a love song. His follow-up album Golden Road made him a star. Somebody Like You became one of the biggest country hits of the decade. Success arrived like a storm. But success can be a dangerous drug for someone who's lived too long in hunger. The applause that once filled him started to leave him empty. Nights blurred into mornings. Bottles replaced sleep. On stage, he was electric. Off stage, he was haunted by the same loneliness that once drove him to pick up the guitar. Fame had given him everything except peace. Then, one night in 2005, everything shifted. At a Hollywood event called G'day LA, he met her. Nicole Kidman. Luminous. Untouchable. The kind of woman whose presence made the room hold its breath. When she smiled, it was as if every song he'd ever written finally made sense. They talked for hours, not as stars, but as two souls who understood loneliness. She spoke of loss and faith. He spoke of darkness and emptiness. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition. Nicole would later say, "I remember thinking, this man has such a gentle heart. I wanted to protect it." And Keith would admit, "She saw the part of me I was afraid to show anyone." Love came fast and fierce. Within a year, they married in Sydney under candlelight and rain. The world watched like a scene written by heaven itself. For a time, everything looked perfect. Keith's songs glowed with hope. Nicole's eyes sparkled again. But old demons don't die easily. Fame whispered. Addiction called. Within months, he relapsed. Nicole didn't run. She intervened, begged him to go to rehab, fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. That act of love saved his life, but it also created a silent debt between them, a burden that no love could fully carry. His songs, like Stupid Boy and Tonight I Wanna Cry, became haunting confessions wrapped in melody. Keith was rising higher than ever. Awards, platinum albums, sold-out tours. But the brighter his fame burned, the more fragile their love became. On stage, he was untouchable. His fingers danced across guitar strings like lightning. His voice carried both raw ache and quiet faith. Magazines crowned them Hollywood's most perfect couple. Cameras captured every handhold, every whispered moment on red carpets. But perfection is the most fragile illusion. Their marriage lived between two galaxies, her world of cinema and his world of song. Nicole disappeared into roles that consumed her. Keith vanished onto endless tours. The same schedules that made them stars were slowly making them strangers. They loved each other deeply. That was never the issue. But love, like music, needs silence to breathe. And silence was the one thing their lives no longer allowed. When they were together, it was fireworks. Tenderness, laughter, a love so pure it almost hurt. But when distance crept in, old ghosts found their way back. Keith's battle with addiction became a private war. Each relapse brought shame. Each recovery brought exhaustion. Nicole remained steadfast, the picture of Grace telling herself, "If I just love him harder, maybe that's enough." She became both wife and guardian, light to his darkness, the voice reminding him who he was. But being someone's savior is a heavy cross to bear, and slowly she began to fade beneath the weight. Keith felt it too. Guilt ate at him. Gratitude turned into dependence. "I owed her everything," he admitted later. But love can't survive when it feels like a debt. In interviews, they smiled. Behind closed doors, silence grew thick. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind born from saying the same things too many times and realizing words can't reach anymore. Still, there were tender moments, quiet breakfasts in Nashville, their daughters laughing in the garden, lullabies at night. But even these scenes carried a quiet ache, like something precious slipping through their fingers. At award shows, Keith sang songs that sounded like love letters. At premieres, Nicole gazed at him as if memorizing his face. To the world, they were devotion incarnate. To themselves, they were two souls trying not to drown in what they'd built. By 2011, Keith's career soared higher than ever. His album Get Closer revealed both longing and loss. Every lyric whispered what he couldn't say aloud. The fear of becoming the man he once was. The guilt of pulling his angel through hell twice. Nicole stepped back from films, retreating into motherhood, trying to hold together what fame was pulling apart. Friends described her as radiant but tired, like someone smiling through rain. They tried everything: counseling, faith, family. Because when love has saved you once, you don't give up easily. But redemption rarely arrives fully healed. Keith was still learning to live without chaos. Nicole was learning to love without fear. Their paths no longer moved in perfect rhythm. Keith once said in a quiet interview, "You can be in love and still be lost." Those words carried more truth than anyone realized. On stage, Keith glowed under the lights. He sang of forgiveness and grace. The crowds wept. Behind the lyrics was a man pleading to believe them himself. Nicole stood by him, composed, forgiving, but her eyes told another story. They had loved each other so fiercely that they forgot how to be gentle. The night would end in applause, but when the music stopped, the silence between them was deafening. Their marriage wasn't a failure. It was a masterpiece painted with pain, courage, and devotion. But even masterpieces crack over time. As the spotlight grew hotter, the distance between them turned from a shadow into a chasm. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't anger. It was two people who had given everything and found they had nothing left to give. Pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it lingers softly like a sad song on repeat. By the mid-2010s, that's what their love had become. A melody beautiful, but breaking. To the public, they were still flawless. But in their home, silence gathered like fog. Nicole would walk past Keith's guitar room, hear the faint strum of strings, and know something inside him was unraveling again. She longed to reach the man who once held her like she was everything. But Keith had built walls around his pain, and this time love couldn't break through. He toured endlessly, chasing a high that fame no longer gave him. She stayed home in Nashville, raising their daughters, holding on to a semblance of normality. Letters replaced conversations. Apologies became habits. Each reunion felt shorter, each goodbye heavier. The man who once whispered, "You're my safe place," now seemed to find safety only on stage. And the woman who once believed love could heal any wound began to doubt the cure. Keith poured his soul into songs like "Blue Ain't Your Color" and "Break on Me." Fans heard romance. Nicole heard goodbye. Each lyric was a confession disguised as melody, every note a silent cry. Fame had given them everything except time, and time was what they needed most. The tabloids speculated wildly, twisting their silence into scandal. But the truth was quieter, sadder. It wasn't betrayal that fractured them. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion from being everything to everyone. From performing love instead of living it. Keith once told a friend, "I don't know how to be both the man she deserves and the man I am." Those words hung in the air like smoke, hard to see, impossible to ignore. Friends noticed the shift. Nicole stopped bringing him to sets. Keith stopped mentioning her in interviews. When asked about each other, they smiled politely. But their eyes told a different story. The ache of two people who once saved each other now quietly letting go. At home, the distance became something you could almost touch. Dinners dissolved into silence, phone calls into missed connections. Nicole began spending more time in Sydney with her mother. Keith stayed behind in Tennessee, working on music, though everyone close to him knew it wasn't just the songs he was trying to fix. He checked into rehab again. This time, not for substances, but for clarity, for stillness. He said he needed to find the sound of peace. But peace doesn't come easily to those who learn to survive through noise. When he returned, she was waiting, patient, loving, but no longer certain. One night, they sat together on their porch, the sky stretched wide above them. She asked softly, "Do you still love me the same way?" He didn't answer right away. Then, in a whisper, he said, "I love you deeper, but not the same." That was the night everything shifted. No fights, no betrayal. Just a quiet acceptance that sometimes love transforms into something that can't survive under the same roof. They drifted apart quietly, gracefully, like leaves falling from trees. Not because they wanted to, but because the season demanded it. For months neither spoke publicly. The world speculated. They stayed silent. Keith began writing songs again, but they didn't sound like radio hits anymore. They sounded like closure. He was mourning, not the loss of a woman, but the end of a chapter that had once saved his life. Years later, in an interview, Keith said, "You can't fix someone who's still trying to figure out who they are." He wasn't speaking about Nicole. He was speaking about himself. They had loved each other fiercely, honestly, but love built on rescue rarely survives the quiet after the storm. When the divorce papers were quietly filed, there was no bitterness, no courtroom drama, just two people who had loved bravely and chose to end gently, not as enemies, but as survivors of something beautiful and doomed. For Keith, the silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was peace, the first true peace he'd felt since boyhood. For Nicole, it was acceptance, the understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone find themselves alone. The song that had once defined them didn't end with applause or heartbreak. It ended softly, like a final chord fading into the night. Years passed. Headlines moved on. New stories replaced old ones. But for Keith Urban, silence became a kind of confession. He no longer chased the glare of fame. He sought the quiet between the noise, that sacred space where truth finally breathes. At 57, sitting across from an interviewer, he was finally asked what the world had always wanted to know. What really happened between you and Nicole? He paused, his hands resting on the guitar that had always told his story better than words. Then softly he said, "People think divorce happens because love dies. But that's not true. Love doesn't die. It changes its form. What died was who I was when she met me." His voice didn't carry bitterness, only clarity. He spoke of his addiction, not to alcohol, not even to fame, but to chaos. "Peace scared me," he admitted. "Nicole gave me a kind of peace I didn't know how to live with. I was always waiting for the storm." She had been his mirror, showing him both his beauty and his brokenness, and he wasn't ready to face either. "She saved me once," he said, "but you can't make someone your reason to stay sober, or your reason to stay alive. That has to come from within." He carried guilt for years, the kind that hums like a melody you can't turn off. Guilt for failing the woman who believed in him more than he believed in himself. Guilt for being loved so deeply and still feeling unworthy. He described nights alone in Nashville, staring at the city lights reflecting off his guitar, whispering to himself, "You had everything, and you still couldn't hold it." But the truth he shared next wasn't about regret. It was about forgiveness. "I used to think love was about staying. Now I think love is about setting each other free when staying starts to hurt." There was no resentment toward Nicole, no bitterness hidden between the lines, only reverence, a quiet gratitude for what she gave him, and what she forced him to discover on his own. "She walked into my life when I was dying inside," he said, "and she walked away when I needed to live again." When asked if he missed her, Keith smiled, that soft, wounded smile that always carried a story. "I don't miss her presence," he said. "I miss the version of myself that she made possible, the man who believed love could heal everything. I'm still trying to find him again." In the years after their separation, Keith found balance, the thing he'd been chasing all his life. He devoted himself to his daughters and to music, not for charts but for truth. Songs like "God Whispered Your Name" carried the calm of a man at peace with his own reflection. He stopped trying to outrun his past and learned to walk beside it. When asked what he'd say to Nicole if she were listening, his answer was simple. "Thank you. You gave me a chance to love, to fail, and to learn what both mean." He didn't deny the pain. He didn't romanticize it. He treated it like a verse in the song of his life, the one that makes the chorus matter. Today, Keith Urban stands not as the broken boy who begged the world to listen, nor as the superstar drowning in applause, but as a man, scarred, steady, serene. At 57, the lines on his face speak of truth, not time. His songs are softer now, slower, wiser. He sings not to prove anything, but to speak with the boy he once was. And though he rarely speaks of Nicole when her name arises, there's no regret, only warmth. He once thought love was the grand finale. Now he knows it's the beginning of understanding. Because love, when real, doesn't end. It transforms, from passion to peace, from holding on to letting go. In quiet corners of Nashville, where the air smells of rain and memory, you might still find him strumming beneath a fading sun. No audience, no spotlight, just a man finally free from the weight of proving anything. He closes his eyes, smiles, and whispers, "I didn't lose Nicole Kidman. I found myself." And in that whisper lies everything, the pain, the beauty, the redemption.